Okay, welcome back. We're on 9.4. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and other leaders and groups in the civil rights movement. Now obviously, there was far more people doing the work of civil rights than just Martin Luther King Jr. and just Malcolm X. But these are two of the really big names, and a lot of the people that we're also going to talk about sort of fell into somewhere between these two men. So we're going to talk about them, we're going to talk about a few other folks, and what happened. So Martin Luther King Jr., as I mentioned the last time, non-violent civil disobedience. So Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers, the Southern Leadership, Southern SLC, Southern something Christian Leadership, League, Southern something like that. Anyway, the SLCL, and the at the beginning, at least, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, believed in this sort of protest. The point was to go out and prove how unfair the laws were by getting arrested, and then showing off how unfair the law was. Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested a bunch of times and thrown in jail a bunch of times. The most famous of which was during that illegal march in Birmingham, Alabama. These photographs are from the march to Montgomery in Selma, Alabama. And the response from the police was generally to beat up the protesters before arresting them. So you see these four pictures. You see, obviously most of the people marching are black, but there definitely were white people included in the march. To be there to support the black civil rights movement, and the police get in there with their tear gas. Sorry, don't need that. And so this is what would happen when these marches would happen, and we talked about the march where John Lewis got beaten and his head basically broken open. Thankfully survived and was a U.S. congressman for decades and decades and decades, and died in 2019. So this all happened now, remember. Now, the most famous of Martin Luther King Jr.'s marches and speeches was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This is where he delivers the I Have a Dream speech. 200,000 people show up to support the 1964 Civil Rights Act bill. And if you've heard a Martin Luther King Jr. speech, this is the one you've heard. Phenomenal speech. Incredibly good writer, incredibly good public speaker. And, of course, we've talked a little bit earlier about the assassination itself. But a few details. This is a picture of the hotel. I was able to find a color picture of it. Makes it seem a little more recent, a little more real, He was killed April 4th, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King was standing on that balcony where that wreath is, basically. And he was shot and killed by a gunman from, I believe, across the road. James Earl Ray is charged with the crime, sentenced to 99 years in jail. He died in jail in 1998. I was alive in high school when he died. So this all happened basically yesterday. This is all part of the modern world. This is all part of the world you're growing up in. There's plenty of people in your life that, I don't know, a lot of people around these days that were around when this happened that you could talk to about what it was like when this happened. There are certainly theories out there that the U.S. government was involved. Not a ton of evidence to support that, but that's the historical thing, right? You look at theories, you look at the evidence behind it. We make our best guess based on our best educated guess based on all of that stuff. Now, it's definitely true the U.S. government had tried to have King killed before. We took a look at that at the FBI letter that they sent to Martin Luther King Jr. to try and get him to commit suicide. So it's not like people are accusing the U.S. government of something they would never ever do. They certainly tried. Just that there's not a ton of evidence that they were involved this time. So we watched this in class. You're certainly free to watch it again. This is the last few minutes of the last speech Martin Luther King Jr. ever gave the night before he was assassinated. Again, fantastic speech. And this one's in color. Again, I try my best to find color photographs and color videos when we can about these people. It just brings it a lot more into the present, brings it a lot, it seems a lot more real, Black and white seems so long ago, and this time period was not long ago. So Malcolm X, he joins the Nation of Islam in 1952. The Nation of Islam is a black civil rights group that advocated armed self-defense against violent white supremacists. And the Nation of Islam is obviously Muslim. The founder, one of the founders, Elijah Muhammad, basically says the true religion of black people should be Islam because white Christians are the ones that took the slaves from Africa, etc. Now again, when we talk religion in class, I'm just saying what they believed. I'm not saying they're right. I'm not saying they're wrong. Not your spiritual advisor. Not here to tell you what to believe or not believe religiously, right? But that was the belief of the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm X joins up and quickly becomes one of its most famous members because, again, fantastic writer, fantastic public speaker, really able to get his point across and get people to understand him. This is the group, by the way, that convinces Cassius Clay to convert to Islam and change his name to Muhammad Ali. So, big important group, a lot of people, anyway, incredibly important group. If you want to know more about Malcolm X, the first book I would recommend would be the Autobiography of Malcolm X. He wrote this book with the help of a journalist that he trusted named Alex Haley. And it's the story of Malcolm X from the point of view of Malcolm X. Now, obviously, you should read more about him than just what he says about himself, but this is a great starting point. Also gives you an idea of how he thought, of where his everything came from. And once, before he was assassinated, he was asked if he hated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because they were definitely on the opposite side of things. Martin Luther King Jr. was saying we need to have peaceful protests, we need to have peaceful civil disobedience. And Malcolm X, along with the rest of the Nation of Islam, and a few of the other groups that we'll talk about, believed that black people needed to make full use of the Second Amendment and arm themselves and defend themselves when necessary. So there was a lot of tension between the two men. They met, I think, once, maybe twice. I think just once, though. And he was asked by a reporter, do you hate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? And Malcolm X said, and I think this is a incredibly interesting quote. It tells you a lot about Malcolm X and how he saw the struggle for civil rights. He says, "I'll say nothing against him. At one time, the whites in the United States called him a racialist, an extremist, and a communist. Then the black Muslims came along, and the whites thanked the Lord for Martin Luther King." So, definitely a bit of that tension there. So, Malcolm X actually leaves the Nation of Islam in 1963. He's not sure this group is the group he needs it to be. He's not sure that this group is going about things the right way. He still believes in armed self-defense, but he doesn't know that the Nation of Islam is the way to go with this. And he does what every Muslim that is financially and physically able to do is supposed to do at least once in their lives, and take the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, one of the pillars of Islam. And he'd never been. He'd never gone to Mecca before. He had never taken the Hajj. So he's like, if I'm going to be a good and devout Muslim, I have the money, I have the time, I have the means, I should make the trek. So he does, and he spends some time in Mecca, and he kind of comes to this realization and is sort of taught by some of the Muslims in Mecca that there's not a race separation in Islam over there. Arabic Muslims, Persian Muslims, African Muslims. As long as you're a Muslim, you're good. It doesn't matter what race you are, right? And so he comes back to America preaching that it's not white people that are the enemy, it's racism. And now there are racist white people, which he would call the enemy, but it's not every single white person. It's racism that we need to fight against. Still advocated armed self-defense, still advocated, making full use of the Second Amendment. Didn't come all the way over to Martin Luther King Jr.'s side of the aisle. But definitely is going out there giving those speeches. And on February 21st, 1965, he's about to give a speech in Manhattan, and he is shot and killed by multiple assailants who, the reports at least say were members of the Nation of Islam. Now, Nation of Islam says it might have been the U.S. government that actually did it. This is something you can dig into if you want to dig into it. But this is one of the photographs of the stage after the assassination. Those circled bits in chalk back there were bullet holes. Whoever killed him rushed the stage, got real close in before they killed him. This was not a sniper shot from far away like Martin Luther King Jr., like John F. Kennedy. This was up close and personal. So this is a small speech. This is a quick speech. We have either already watched it or we will watch it in class. But it's just 2 or 3 minutes, and it's Malcolm X talking about police brutality. And if you ever wondered, why would anybody follow Malcolm X if he was talking about violence and talking about this? I'm not saying, you need to follow him. I'm not saying, forget about Martin Luther King Jr., this is the real guy. But if you've been wondering why people would choose to follow him instead of following Martin Luther King Jr., following other civil rights leaders, this speech really shows that charisma, right? Really shows, how he could get his point across. And again, I'm not saying he was right. I'm not saying that the way he said we needed to fix things was right. He was definitely right that racism was a problem in America in the 1960s and that needed to be fixed. But his solutions, I'm not saying those were the best. But if you ever wonder, why would anybody have listened to him instead of King? You should take a look at some of his speeches. And again, you might not agree with him. You might think, wow, I definitely don't think that's right. But you need to understand where he's coming from, what his points were, and how he made those points, and why he became so popular. If you really want to understand this point in U.S. history. Speaking of this point in U.S. history, not too long after Malcolm X was killed, about a year or less later, the Black Panther Party is founded by Huey P. Newton, the gentleman in the chair. Technically, the full name of the party was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Again, big Second Amendment types. Black people in America needed to get guns. They needed to learn how to use them. Not to go, murder people, but, if the KKK was trying to break into your house or burn a cross on your lawn, maybe have a gun. And this made a lot of people in the U.S. really nervous, and they were based out of California. And so the National Rifle Association teams up with the governor of California at the time, Ronald Reagan, the same one that's president in the 80s that we'll learn about, to pass a whole bunch of gun control legislation in the state of California to restrict the types of guns that groups could buy, like the Black Panther Party. So, the National Rifle Association hasn't always been 100% for the Second Amendment all the time. Notable exceptions here and there in their history, Most of the time, very pro-Second Amendment. National Rifle Association. This time, they were the ones pushing for gun control. So the Freedom Riders, another group, a very important group during this time period. There were a few Supreme Court cases in the early 1960s. We've talked about a couple of them. Some of them we're probably not going to talk about because they were a little bit, they were important, but not high school class trying to cover all of U.S. history since the Civil War in a few months. You take a dedicated class to this time period, you'll talk about all the Supreme Court cases because they're very important. But a bunch of them in the 1960s kind of together outlawed segregation in interstate travel at restaurants, at travel routes, etc., nationwide. And most of those places in the North, they integrated because they kind of had to. Some of them had already integrated, because of the work of civil rights activists. But most of the ones in the North, by this point, the Supreme Court says they have to. I guess they have to. A lot of them weren't happy about it, but they did. But a lot of these places in the South, Greyhound bus terminals, restaurants, waiting rooms that are along the interstate highways, they refused the court order. They just said, forget it, we're not going to do what you say we have to do. And so these integrated groups of white and black protesters, they'd get together, they'd get on a Greyhound bus in the North, and they would just ride it all the way into the South. And they would get beaten by the KKK, they'd get beaten by the police, they'd get beaten by just mobs of random, white Southerners. At least one bus was firebombed. One of the times this happened in Alabama, this famous Alabama politician, Bull Connor, told a mob that had gathered outside of one of these Greyhound buses that had come down with Freedom Riders. He didn't try and calm down the mob. He just told them, I don't give a goddamn if you kill them. You got 15 minutes, and nobody's going to get arrested. So he's like, you can have, it's basically a 15-minute purge, mini purge. You just do whatever you want to the bus and the people on it. And then I'm going to clear the mob out, but no one's going to get arrested for anything they do. So that's what these Freedom Riders were up against, and they kept coming, and they kept doing it. A lot of them were killed, a lot of them were beaten and injured. Pretty rough time period. Robert F. Kennedy, we talked about him a little bit already. He starts his official political career as the Attorney General to his brother, President John F. Kennedy. Nepotism, maybe. John F. Kennedy gets elected. Who do you want as your Attorney General? My brother? Maybe not. Maybe not the choice I would make. I love my brothers, but, maybe not just give them high-ranking government positions just because, But Robert F. Kennedy turned out to be pretty good at the job. He's very pro-civil rights, much more involved with the civil rights movement than John F. Kennedy was. And he becomes a close friend of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez. We'll talk more about Chavez tomorrow, I think. Soon, very soon, but I think tomorrow. And he's pushing John F. Kennedy to go further and further and further on civil rights while Kennedy is president. Of course, John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy kind of steps off and does civil rights work for the next few years, supports Lyndon Johnson when he runs again in 1964. But when President Johnson declines to run in 1968, Robert F. Kennedy starts his run for president. He starts speaking out against racism, against the mafia, and against the Vietnam War. Very popular politician. This is the speech he gives the night that Martin Luther King Jr. dies. I think we've watched this in class already. If we haven't, we will. But again, fantastic speech. And he just kind of had to get up and give this. This wasn't a speech he'd prepared and practice. He just had to. He was told, "Hey, Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated. Go tell this crowd of mostly black people that Martin Luther King Jr. got assassinated." And he did. Now, April 1968, King was killed. So a few months later, the next month. A month later, less than a month later, Robert F. Kennedy wins the California primary election. So he's not getting elected president yet, but he's getting elected to run for the Democratic nomination, the Democratic Party. And a few hours later, he gets shot and killed by an assassin, Sirhan Sirhan. He claims that he does it because Robert Kennedy supports Israel and not Palestine, and Sirhan Sirhan's Palestinian. Again, like a lot of these other people, a lot of other theories about what happened. Was it the mob? Was it whoever killed John F. Kennedy? Obviously not Lee Harvey Oswald, but was there a conspiracy behind John F. Kennedy that killed Robert F. Kennedy? Was it the CIA? Was it who knows, right? Now the evidence points to Sirhan Sirhan did it for the reason he claimed he did it. But again, this is another rabbit hole you can jump down, much like the John F. Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, and the Malcolm X assassination. So other groups want civil rights too, and we're going to talk about them next time on U.S. History. We're going to talk about some athletes. We're going to talk about some migrant workers, Cesar Chavez. We're going to talk about Native Americans and the American Indian movement. Women still want civil rights. They got the right to vote in 1920, but doesn't end there. And much, much more. See you next time on U.S. History.